Greg Miller stood in the warm sunlight, admiring the sparkling blue water of his newly completed backyard pool. The final tile had been set, and now, as the water filled the pool, Greg's heart swelled with pride and accomplishment. This pool was a dream come true, a retreat for his family from the oppressive summer heat. But before we dive into the story, make sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our exciting stories. His children's laughter echoed through the air as they played near the water, eagerly waiting to jump in for their first swim. For Greg and his wife Jean, the pool represented years of saving and planning. It was meant to be a peaceful haven, a place for the family to relax, unwind, and escape from the busy world outside. That first weekend, everything seemed perfect. The kids had a blast, and Greg and Jean sat back, content, watching their dream come to life in their own backyard. However, by the following weekend, things began to change. As the heat continued to beat down on the neighborhood, it didn't take long for people to notice the sparkling blue water in the Miller's backyard. At first, it was just a few friendly neighbors, towels in hand, stopping by and asking if their kids could take a quick swim. Greg and Jean, being kind and generous people, said yes. After all, they wanted to be good neighbors and share their good fortune. Besides, how could they say no to the excited faces of the neighborhood children? But as word spread through the community, the trickle of visitors quickly turned into a steady stream. Neighbors Greg barely knew started showing up with coolers, umbrellas, and lawn chairs, ready to spend their entire afternoon at the Miller's pool. What had once been a serene family retreat was rapidly turning into a public pool. Greg and Jean found themselves hosting impromptu pool parties nearly every day, with kids splashing and laughing from morning until night. At first, Greg and Jean tolerated the situation with polite smiles. They loved the sound of children's laughter, and they didn't want to be the bad guys by turning anyone away. But as the days turned into weeks, the constant invasion of their private space began to take a toll. Greg had budgeted for pool maintenance, chemicals, and cleaning, but he hadn't anticipated the social cost of having a pool that everyone in the neighborhood wanted to use. It wasn't just the number of people that was the problem. It was the sense of entitlement that some of the neighbors began to display. People started showing up unannounced, and some didn't even bother to knock. They'd simply let themselves into the backyard, assuming it was fine to use the pool whenever they liked. The Millers' once peaceful sanctuary was now a bustling, noisy hub of activity, and Greg and Jean were left to wonder if they'd ever have their backyard to themselves again. One afternoon, their neighbor Sandra came over with her kids. "Would it be all right if the kids took a swim in your pool?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Greg and Jean exchanged a glance. They had been talking about the growing problem of uninvited guests for days, but when they saw the excitement on Sandra's kids' faces, they softened. "Of course," Jean said with a smile, but let's set some ground rules." That's when Greg and Jean decided to take control of the situation. They sat down with the neighborhood kids and their parents and laid out some basic guidelines. No pets in the pool, no loud music, no unsupervised kids, and everyone had to clean up after themselves. Most of the parents nodded in agreement, and for a while it seemed like the situation was under control. But as the number of visitors continued to grow, so did the challenges. One day, Greg noticed a Labrador swimming happily in the pool, much to the delight of the children. He felt his anger rise. Pets were strictly off limits, and the dog's claws could easily damage the pool's lining. Jean quickly stepped in to defuse the situation. "Whose dog is this?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Sandra, the same neighbor who had asked to use the pool earlier, stepped forward. "I'm so sorry, Jean. It's ours. I didn't realize the kids had let him in. We'll get him out right away." Sandra's apology was sincere, but the damage was already done. Greg and Jean had been more than generous with their neighbors, and now they were starting to feel taken advantage of. The incident with the dog was a turning point. The trust they had extended to their neighbors was beginning to fray, and they started to wonder if it was time to take more drastic measures to protect their pool and their peace of mind. Over the next few weeks, Greg and Jean tried to enforce their rules, but it became increasingly difficult. The pool had become a magnet for the neighborhood kids, and more people began showing up without asking. The once quiet backyard was now filled with the constant sound of splashing, shouting, and laughter. And while Greg and Jean were happy that the kids were having fun, they missed the peace and tranquility they had originally envisioned for their backyard oasis. One day, Greg came home from work to find a group of kids playing in the pool with a large German Shepherd. He could feel his frustration boiling over. The dog had torn part of the pool's lining, and the cost of repairs would be significant. This was exactly what Greg had feared would happen when pets were allowed in the pool. He confronted the kids, and they quickly called the dog out of the water, but the damage was done. That evening, Greg and Jean sat down to discuss their options. They had tried to be generous, they had tried to set rules, but it wasn't working. The pool, which had once been a source of joy and pride, was now a source of stress and frustration. Greg knew something had to change, and he made a decision. They were going to take back their pool, even if it meant upsetting some of their neighbors. The next morning, Greg made a few phone calls. By the end of the week, a large truck arrived at the miller's house, and workers began erecting a tall wooden fence around the backyard. Greg had decided that the only way to reclaim their privacy was to put up a physical barrier. The fence would keep out uninviting guests and make it clear that the pool was for the miller's use only. As the fence went up, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some parents were upset, feeling that Greg was being selfish, while others understood his decision. The fence was a bold move, and it sparked debates at neighborhood gatherings. Some people felt that Greg had overreacted, while others sympathized with his need to protect his property and his family's privacy. For Greg, the fence was a necessary step to reclaim his backyard and his peace of mind. He didn't want to alienate his neighbors, but he also didn't want to be taken advantage of any longer. The pool had become a symbol of the fine line between generosity and self-preservation, and Greg was determined to protect what he had worked so hard to build. Jean, ever the peacemaker, organized a neighborhood potluck in an attempt to smooth things over. She wanted to remind everyone that while they had set boundaries, they still valued their community and wanted to maintain good relationships. But for Greg, the fence represented more than just a boundary. It was a reminder that sometimes even the kindest people need to protect their space. As the summer drew to a close, the fence around the miller's backyard became a quiet fixture in the neighborhood. People stopped asking to use the pool, and the steady stream of visitors slowed to a trickle. Greg and Jean were finally able to enjoy their backyard in peace. The pool, once a source of stress, became a place of relaxation once again. In the weeks that followed, Greg noticed a shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The initial resentment over the fence began to fade, and people started to respect the miller's desire for privacy. Small gestures of reconciliation started to appear. One day, Greg found a card in his mailbox with notes from several of the neighborhood children apologizing for their behavior. Another day, a neighbor left a basket of cookies at their door with a note thanking them for the joy the pool had brought during the hot summer days. Jean, seeing these gestures, turned to Greg one evening and said, "Maybe this whole experience was necessary. It's helped everyone learn to respect each other's boundaries." Greg, reflecting on everything that had happened, nodded. He had started the summer wanting to share the joy of his pool with others, but he had learned that generosity without limits could lead to frustration and resentment. In the end, the fence had been a necessary step, not just to protect their pool, but to restore balance in their lives. As autumn arrived, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The Miller's Pool was no longer the community hub it had once been, but the sense of mutual respect that had been restored was worth more than the carefree summer days they had lost. For Greg and Jean, the fence symbolized a lesson learned, that setting boundaries, both physical and emotional, is sometimes necessary to maintain harmony. The pool, now covered for the winter, lay dormant under the fading autumn leaves, but for Greg, it was more than just a backyard feature. It was a reminder that balance between generosity and self-preservation is essential for peace of mind. As he looked out over the quiet backyard, Greg felt a sense of calm. The summer had been full of challenges, but in the end, he had done what he needed to protect his home and his family, and for that, he had no regrets.